To help with our journalism chops, I'm happy to bring in a seasoned defense reporter to help us dive into the outlook for defense industry. Bryan Bender is a senior national correspondent for Politico and author of Morning Defense Newsletter, of which I am an avid reader. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Good to see you all. Good to be back.
How are things going, my friend?
We're hanging in there. Got shot number one, so waiting on shot number two and starting to feel liberated. Fingers crossed.
Well, when I get my shot number two, we can grab a beer one of these days. It's been too long.
Nice.
So, I mentioned that I read your morning newsletter every morning. And one of the stories and themes I've really picked up on is the aerospace and defense industry, how they're talking about the new administration and Congress, how they're planning new investments. And so I thought, you as really somebody who's watching this more closely than most, you might have some insight. What are we seeing? What are the big trends out there?
Well, I think it's clear that the Trump buildup, if you will, is over. We went through the last 3 or 4 years in which we had an administration that advocated for more defense spending in a host of areas. And I think a combination of a new administration with different priorities, different areas where it wants to invest, not to mention a year of COVID and, government expenditures at historic levels. I think it's sort of logical that the Pentagon budget is going to get squeezed. It looks like it won't grow. It doesn't look like it will get cut very much, but it'll be flat and it may not even account for inflation. So what does that mean? That means that the Pentagon budget people and the Office of Management and Budget at the White House got to figure out, well, what do we cut or what do we delay? And how do we find money in the budget for things that we want to prioritize, like climate change? They see a big role for the Pentagon in climate change and helping to drive that forward. So it's going to be interesting to see what this budget will look like when it comes out. I think we'll get an early version, a sort of pared down version of President Biden's first budget proposal here in a couple days, and then the full proposal, I think, early May.
Well, to help us even really get a better picture of what defense industry is looking at, we have a special guest, somebody I think you know pretty well, right?
Yes, Eric Fanning. Eric is currently the CEO of the Aerospace Industries Association, but he knows where all the bodies are buried. He was Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Air Force, and now obviously is immersed in advocating for and trying to navigate this new world on behalf of a lot of Pentagon contractors and many contractors in the communities where your members are.
Well, welcome, Eric. I appreciate you joining us.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm going to play the reporter here and ask you, Eric, you've been in government at the highest levels in the Pentagon, and you've had to make some of these tough decisions about where do we put our taxpayer dollars. I think we'd all be interested in your read on how this might play out. Where do you see, what's got to give, and where do you see there being maybe some new opportunities?
Well, I do think certainly everybody is watching to see what's going to happen with the budget, what the administration is going to propose, what's going to happen on the Hill. Bryan, I agree with you. I think most people do. We expect the budget to be relatively flat. There's a lot of bipartisan support for defense spending and making sure we have a strong national security. A flat budget, of course, means that purchase power erodes over time. But the real interesting thing to me will be where the money goes, as opposed to exactly how much the top line is. And there's not a whole lot you can do in your first budget when you're a new administration. There's not a lot of time before you got to drop it on the Hill. So we'll be looking for hints, I think, little seeds of where they're starting to invest. In the second and third year, it's going to get more interesting because as those investments grow, as they put more money into some new things that some new capabilities they're trying to build, they're going to have to find bill payers for that. And so some things are going to have to go. And so that's kind of what I think everybody is watching right now. And I think everybody on both sides of the aisle is really thinking about this through the lens of China. What do we need to do for a high-end fight against China? And perhaps even more importantly, what do we need to do to deter China so we never get to a high-end fight with China?
So,
if we have a couple of minutes, I think one issue that I think will affect a lot of defense communities out there, military bases and the surrounding communities, is this focus on climate change and energy efficiency. We've heard it many times that this administration wants to use the Pentagon to help drive this larger policy. I'm curious what you see as some of the things that might affect some of those local communities. What kind of policies, what kind of investments?
Well, it is interesting. Everybody wants to use the Pentagon for everything because of the size of its budget, of course. But this is a problem that everyone recognizes. The Pentagon has recognized for a long time. It impacts a number of things. It impacts how you think about conflict, where that conflict will be, what will cause the conflict. It certainly impacts installations, particularly those that are being impacted most by climate change, naval bases, facilities in the Arctic. You just had Sherry Goodman on. But in terms of investment, we're all trying to figure that out right now. What will this administration do in its efforts to fight climate change? And as you mentioned, one strong possibility is, because of the size of the department and its ability to scale, is investing in new types of energy sources, sustainable energy. If the department says we're going to go all electric for our fleets on installations, that has a big impact. That's a big buy. And so we look to see the department investing in how it does things differently, but probably in new technologies as well, both to bring down its costs, its fuel consumption, which is an enormous part of the department's budget, but also what these new capabilities might be as they look into the future and warfighting in the future.
well, sir, kind of shifting this down to even more at the local level, our members really look at their defense sector holistically and through the lens of economic development. So besides the defense budget, which worries everybody, what can communities do to really support increased defense industry spending, increased investment? What are really the challenges that are facing some of your aerospace partners?
Well, we actually are finishing a study with McKinsey right now on what the industry can do. We don't always just ask the government, point to the government and tell it what we think it should do. We know we've got to look internally and do things too. And there are three main elements to that study, all of which I think the local communities can be a part of. First is, we know we have to do a better job and more work about talking about what the industry does, the technology that the industry is involved with, the problems, the current and future problems that the industry is focused on, and how the technology that comes out of these programs and these investments can then enter in other ways into society, like GPS, for example, did. So that's one thing that can help to make sure that we are attracting the right workforce, attracting a good workforce. Second, of course, is reskilling, upskilling, lots of training as the Department of Defense shifts in what it wants to acquire and thinks about those future technologies. We have a great trained workforce, but we need to make sure it stays current and ready for what those new technologies are we'll be working on. And then the third is, we know, industry writ large knows, we certainly know in aerospace and defense, we've got to keep focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion to make sure that we are appealing to the broadest population of Americans possible, not leaving everyone off the table as we compete for talent. And then I would finally just say, all the work that I've seen over the years that your groups do in support of the local communities, in conjunction with the base, with industry, is really helpful in making sure that they stay sort of geographical centers. Industry wants to stay where the customer is. And so all that you do to support those installations makes a big difference.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Bryan, did you have one last question? I know we're running out of time here, but I think we've got time for one more if you wanted to follow up.
Well, I mean, maybe one question would be, since you represent a lot of the large Pentagon contractors, what are you hearing from them in terms of what their biggest either concern is or what's on their minds is the biggest question mark about what's
Well,
coming down the pike.
Workforce is always a strategic concern for industry, for the CEOs in particular. The budget, of course, what's going to happen with the budget. And then third, which you've all talked about on the show already, is COVID, getting past COVID and making sure that the industrial base, the supply chain stays whole and the workforce stays whole. So there's a lot of work remaining to help make sure, because those two things really in some ways are the same, the industrial base and workforce, that we remain whole because we're still working, the adversary is still investing, that we remain whole through COVID. So when we get past this, we can still meet the needs of the warfighter.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on that. You played a pretty significant role in advocating for Congress to extend its so-called 3610 authority. In other words, the government can reimburse companies that have to pay their employees who are not going to work because the facilities where they work are government facilities or others that have been shut down by the pandemic. That was extended through September, and the Pentagon has doled out some funding for that, but that program's not funded. In other words, there's no appropriation for it. So is there anything in your world that you're trying to do to make sure that that turns into real money and that contractors don't get left in the lurch?
Well, we are. There are a lot of costs, obviously, to doing business during COVID. Certainly a part of that is if you're trying to keep your workforce intact, and this is a highly skilled, trained workforce that could go someplace else if they were furloughed or let go. And we want to make sure, as I said, that it's whole at the end of COVID. And so we're doing a lot on the Hill in the administration. So we have these authorities to be reimbursed for things that we can't do because of COVID. The facilities are shut, as you mentioned, and are working with Congress to try and figure out if we can find a way to have this funded so that the Pentagon doesn't have to pay these bills out of other accounts, which more than likely means modernization accounts.
Well, thank you, sir. And Bryan, I really appreciate both of your time today. I hope we can get you involved with ADC in the future, and I really appreciate your insights.